Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines, special Sunday edition of Earthly Headlines. So today we're going to talk about the Andes Mountains and the ancient Andean genomes that come from that area. Now, if you guys don't know about the Andes, it's this huge mountain range in South America that a lot of indigenous people live up there. And here's a pretty good picture of, I think this is Machu Picchu, but I can't be sure. There's been a lot of talk for as long as I can remember about people people who lived at the high altitude of the Andes they had long lives, they were healthy, they were robust. People who were sick and then went up to the Andes and lived there, they got better. People had energy and they were vibrant up into their 60s and 70s and 80s. There was this documentary that maybe I'll have a link later, but if I recall correctly, there was a rancher who lived up in the Andes. He was raising cattle and all this other stuff, living off the land, and he was well into his 90s, and he smoked, and he was active till I don't know if he's alive now, but I mean, he literally lived off the land, and he did everything himself. He walked probably miles and miles every day in really high altitude. So anyway, a lot of people who all throughout history, people have looked for the fountain of youth, all this stuff. So the Andes have been one of the places that those seekers would talk about. And so all these legends came from there. So this study talks about the farming in altitude, and they analyze the genomes of those people who live there. So this comes from the American Society of Human Genetics in San Diego. So it opens, ancient populations in the Andes of Peru adapted to their high altitude environment and the introduction of agriculture in ways distinct from other global populations that face similar circumstances. So they're prefacing this by basically, the other populations in other parts of the earth, they faced similar circumstances in terms of agriculture, their diet and stuff like that. But there's something about the Andes that sets them apart from how they develop genetically compared to the others in other parts of the world. This guy John Lindo, he's assistant professor of anthropology at Emory University, and he led a group of international collaborators in this study. So what they did was they took these 7,000-year-old DNA samples from 7 complete genomes, and they wanted to compare it with other people and study how ancient people in the Andes adapted to their environment. They compared these genomes with 64 modern-day genomes of people who are living now, and from both highland populations in the Andes and lowland populations in Chile. So they wanted to see first they wanted to see the difference between lowland people and highland people. So they wanted to pin down the genetic qualities of the people who lived in really high altitude, and also they wanted to identify the genetic adaptations that took place before the arrival of the Europeans in the 1500s. They want to get the most pure genetic data, that basically the undisturbed genetic data before the Europeans came. Because when the Europeans came in the 1500s, they destroyed a lot of stuff. Like 90% of the lowland people were killed. Like 20 to 30% of the people in the highlands were killed. Smallpox was running rampant. There was a lot of social disruption going on. What Dr. Lindo wanted to do, he wanted to focus on the period right before that. You can kind of separate those historical events from the actual data and what got them to that point before the Spanish came and the Portuguese. So here's what they found. They found that the Andean population's genomes adapted to the introduction of agriculture and resulting increase in starch consumption differently from other populations. So this is where it gets really interesting. So the genomes of European farmers, they show an increased number of copies of this gene called amylase that codes for amylase, which is an enzyme in saliva that helps break down starchy stuff. So when the Europeans adopted farming, they started creating more amylase. Basically, the gene coding for amylase was more frequent and stronger in their genetic code. But the Andeans, when they took the same approach, they took the high starch diet and they took farming and agriculture, their genomes didn't have the same issue. They didn't do the same thing. They didn't have additional copies of the amylase gene. So what happened? Why didn't they're all human, right? So what's the difference between the Andean people and the European people when it comes to having a similar diet? Here's another example. Tibetan genomes, another group who lives in high altitude, really high altitude, they have genetic changes related to hypoxia. So basically that's how the body responds to low level of oxygen. And as you know, the higher you go up in altitude, the less oxygen there is in the air. So your body changes. The Andean genomes, who, again, their population is also very high altitude, they didn't have those changes either. So they adapted to high altitude in a different way. So what's going on in the Andes? Is there maybe the fountain of youth is real? Maybe maybe that area of the globe is in a very unique position where something is mingling with the humans there, or any life there, that's giving them these restorative properties of some sort. Who knows? Anyway, we continue. After contact with the Europeans, the highland Andeans experienced population reduction 27%, and then the lowland populations decreased by 96%. The study goes on, and then the article says genetic results suggested that by living in a harsher environment, highland populations may have been somewhat buffered from the reach and resulting effects of European contact. So the highland people, it turns out that their immune-related genes were selected after the arrival of Europeans. Basically, they had a more natural resistance to smallpox and all the other pathogens that the Europeans brought compared to the lowland people. Right, so these related genes after the arrival of the Europeans suggested that the Andeans who survived were better able to respond to newly introduced diseases like smallpox. Dr. Lindo now and his team, they're exploring a new set of ancient DNA samples from the Incan capital Cusco, as well as a nearby lowland group. So now they're going to conduct the same genetic study, but on a different sample of people in Cusco, and another lowland group, and see what happens. See what patterns emerge, or if there's any similarities, or if there are any stark differences between this study in the Andes and then this Incan capital of Cusco study. And then they're also going to study the gene flow and genetic exchange resulting from the wide-ranging trade routes of ancient Andeans. So let me pull up a map of the Andes. Here we go. Okay, so here's the Andes. This is where they conducted, this is the Peruvian here we go, right here. So the Peruvian Andes are here. But you can see this it runs the length of South America here. So there were tons and tons of trade routes here. A lot of activity going on that we don't even really know about, or we didn't know about maybe 50 years ago. Just to give you a visual, this is what we're dealing with here, and this is, you can see how high things can get here. And I don't know if it's a coincidence that these same sites where the Mayans and the Incans lived, and then all these anomalies that you find, like Pumapunku, they're all in the Andes. So what was going on here? So now we have this genetic anomaly now. So there's a lot of stuff coming up in this area, and there's a lot of mystery here. And anyone who says that there's no mystery or there's nothing here, they need a reality check, and they need to read a few books, because there's definitely something going on here. And then Dr. Lindo is cool. He's saying that it's a great start to an interesting body of research, but we would like to see future studies involving larger numbers of genomes in order to achieve a better resolution of genetic adaptations throughout history. Because right now, he knows that even though we've mapped the human genome and all that stuff, there's still a lot of gray areas that we don't know about, and there's a lot of fuzzy, unclear parts of the genome and the history of our genome that get criticized, and rightfully so. They get criticized because of this. A lot of people still don't believe any genetic data whatsoever, just because they think it's all hooey, first of all. But remember, it's an incomplete science. Genetics did not come out like a long time ago. I mean, we're talking late 80s, lower part of 30 years. So I don't know why people think that they can just get all this information. There has to be a lot of research done involving this, and larger numbers of genomes have to be integrated in the studies in order to, like you said, to get closer to the truth of what was going on. And it's amazing that we can already get to this point. So now we know that the Andes, all those legends about the Andes, there was some truth to it, because there's definitely something going on. And now that we know that there's some genetic anomalies going on in the Andes, there's got to be a lot of investigation going on here, because who knows what secrets are hidden in these mountains. So let me know what you guys think about the Andes. Have you guys ever been there? Can you share your experience when being there? Was the air different? Were people different? Did you meet with any natives, non-tourists? Was there anything distinct or peculiar about your trip there? Because I would love to know that, and just to cross-examine that with people who I have personally already talked to, people who have been to Machu Picchu and other parts of the Andes. They tell me that it's not that difficult to breathe up there. And this is someone who lived in Denver that I knew, where, Denver is a mile-high city, right? They say that they have an easier time breathing there than in Denver. So I don't know what to make of that. Some people they say they felt energized, they were in better spirits. So there's a lot of mystery going on here. And I think the implications of this study, the important part of the study, even though they didn't find a lot, they found some important distinctions. One, not every human are created equal. Not all human populations are the same, obviously. There's different genetics going on. But really, there's a door now that has yet to be opened and has been verified in the form of the wild card of the environment at play here. So now there might be some profound effect that the environment has, and the position that let's say the population is living in some village in the part of the earth that has a direct effect on your genetics. I mean, that's kind of implied here through the study. It hasn't been proven, but there's a light there. I mean, there's something there that a light needs to be shined on now, and there's reasonable doubt to go in there and investigate further. I mean, it's not an open and shut case now. This is just scratching the surface of what's there. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.